Where Angels Fear to Tread by E. M. Forster. Read for you by Julie Pandia. Chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The advance of regret can be so gradual that it is impossible to say, "Yesterday I was happy, today I am not." At no one moment did Lilia realize that her marriage was a failure. Yet during the summer and autumn she became as unhappy as it was possible for her nature to be. She had no unkind treatment and few unkind words from her husband. He simply left her alone. In the morning he went out to do business, which as far as she could discover meant sitting in the farmacia. He usually returned to lunch, after which he retired to another room and slept. In the evening he grew vigorous again, and took the air on the ramparts, often having his dinner out, and seldom returning till midnight or later. There were, of course, the times when he was away altogether, at Empoli, Siena, Florence, Bologna, for he delighted in travel, and seemed to pick up friends all over the country. Lilia often heard what a favourite he was. She began to see that she must assert herself, but she could not see how. Her self-confidence, which had overthrown Philip, had gradually oozed away. If she left the strange house, there was the strange little town. If she were to disobey her husband and walk in the country, that would be stranger still. Vast slopes of olives and vineyards, with chalk-white farms, and in the distance other slopes, with more olives and more farms, and more little towns outlined against the cloudless sky. "I don't call this country," she would say. "Why, it's not as wild as Sawston Park." And indeed there was scarcely a touch of wildness in it. Some of those slopes had been under cultivation for 2000 years. But it was terrible and mysterious all the same, and its continued presence made Lilia so uncomfortable that she forgot her nature and began to reflect. She reflected chiefly about her marriage. The ceremony had been hasty and expensive, and the rites, whatever they were not those of the Church of England. Lilia had no religion in her, but for hours at a time she would be seized with a vulgar fear that she was not "married properly," and that her social position in the next world might be as obscure as it was in this. It might be safer to do the thing thoroughly, and one day she took the advice of Spiridione and joined the Roman Catholic Church, or as she called it, Santa Deodata's. Gino approved. He too thought it safer, and it was fun confessing, though the priest was a stupid old man, and the whole thing was a good slap in the face for the people at home. The people at home took the slap very soberly. Indeed, there were few left for her to give it to. The Herritons were out of the question. They would not even let her write to Irma, though Irma was occasionally allowed to write to her. Mrs. Theobald was rapidly subsiding into dotage, and as far as she could be definite about anything, she had definitely sided with the Herritons. And Miss Abbott did likewise. Night after night did Lilia curse this false friend, who had agreed with her that the marriage would do, and that the Herritons would come round to it, and then, at the first hint of opposition, had fled back to England shrieking and distraught. Miss Abbott headed the long list of those who should never be written to, and who should never be forgiven. Almost the only person who was not on that list was Mr. Kingcroft, who had unexpectedly sent an affectionate and inquiring letter. He was quite sure never to cross the Channel, and Lilia drew freely on her fancy in the reply. At first she had seen a few English people, for Monteriano was not the end of the earth. One or two inquisitive ladies, who had heard at home of her quarrel with the Herritons, came to call. She was very sprightly, and they thought her quite unconventional, and Gino a charming boy, so all that was to the good. But by May the season, such as it was, had finished, and there would be no one till next spring. As Mrs. Herriton had often observed, Lilia had no resources. She did not like music or reading or work. Her one qualification for life was rather blowsy high spirits, which turned querulous and boisterous according to circumstances. She was not obedient, but she was cowardly, and in the most gentle way, which Mrs. Herriton might have envied, Gino made her do what he wanted. At first it had been rather fun to let him get the upper hand, but it was galling to discover that he could not do otherwise. He had a good strong will when he chose to use it, and would not have had the least scruple in using bolts and locks to put it into effect. There was plenty of brutality deep down in him, and one day Lilia nearly touched it. It was the old question of going out alone. "I always do it in England." "This is Italy." "Yes, but I'm older than you, and I'll settle." "I am your husband," he said, smiling. They had finished their midday meal, and he wanted to go and sleep. Nothing would rouse him up, until at last Lilia, getting more and more angry, said, "And I've got the money." He looked horrified. Now was the moment to assert herself. She made the statement again. He got up from his chair. "And you'd better mend your manners," she continued, "for you'd find it awkward if I stopped drawing cheques." She was no reader of character, but she quickly became alarmed. As she said to Perfetta afterwards, "None of his clothes seem to fit, too big in one place, too small in another." His figure rather than his face altered, the shoulders falling forward till his coat wrinkled across the back and pulled away from his wrists. He seemed all arms. He edged round the table to where she was sitting, and she sprang away and held the chair between them, too frightened to speak or to move. He looked at her with round, expressionless eyes, and slowly stretched out his left hand. Perfetta was heard coming up from the kitchen. It seemed to wake him up, and he turned away and went to his room without a word. "What has happened?" cried Lilia, nearly fainting. "He is ill, ill." Perfetta looked suspicious when she heard the account. "What did you say to him?" She crossed herself. "Hardly anything," said Lilia, and crossed herself also. Thus did the two women pay homage to their outraged male. It was clear to Lilia at last that Gino had married her for money. But he had frightened her too much to leave any place for contempt. His return was terrifying, for he was frightened too, imploring her pardon, lying at her feet, embracing her, murmuring, "It was not I," striving to define things which he did not understand. He stopped in the house for 3 days, positively ill with physical collapse. But for all his suffering he had tamed her, and she never threatened to cut off supplies again. Perhaps he kept her even closer than convention demanded. But he was very young, and he could not bear it to be said of him that he did not know how to treat a lady or to manage a wife. And his own social position was uncertain. Even in England a dentist is a troublesome creature, whom careful people find difficult to class. He hovers between the professions and the trades. He may be only a little lower than the doctors, or he may be down among the chemists, or even beneath them. The son of the Italian dentist felt this too. For himself nothing mattered. He made friends with the people he liked, for he was that glorious invariable creature, a man. But his wife should visit nowhere rather than visit wrongly. Seclusion was both decent and safe. The social ideals of North and South had had their brief contention, and this time the South had won. It would have been well if he had been as strict over his own behaviour as he was over hers. But the incongruity never occurred to him for a moment. His morality was that of the average Latin, and as he was suddenly placed in the position of a gentleman, he did not see why he should not behave as such. Of course, had Lilia been different, had she asserted herself and got a grip on his character, he might possibly, though not probably, have been made a better husband as well as a better man, and at all events he could have adopted the attitude of the Englishman, whose standard is higher even when his practice is the same. But had Lilia been different, she might not have married him. The discovery of his infidelity, which she made by accident, destroyed such remnants of self-satisfaction as her life might possess. She broke down utterly and sobbed and cried in Perfetta's arms. Perfetta was kind and even sympathetic, but cautioned her on no account to speak to Gino, who would be furious if he was suspected. And Lilia agreed, partly because she was afraid of him, partly because it was, after all, the best and most dignified thing to do. She had given up everything for him, her daughter, her relatives, her friends, all the little comforts and luxuries of a civilized life, and even if she had the courage to break away, there was no one who would receive her now. The Herritons had been almost malignant in their efforts against her, and all her friends had one by one fallen off. So it was better to live on humbly, trying not to feel, endeavouring by a cheerful demeanour to put things right. "Perhaps," she thought, "if I have a child he'll be different. I know he wants a son." Lilia had achieved pathos despite herself, for there are some situations in which vulgarity counts no longer. Not Cordelia nor Imogen more deserves our tears. She herself cried frequently, making herself look plain and old, which distressed her husband. He was particularly kind to her when he hardly ever saw her, and she accepted his kindness without resentment, even with gratitude. So docile had she become. She did not hate him, even as she had never loved him. With her it was only when she was excited that the semblance of either passion arose. People said she was headstrong, but really her weak brain left her cold. Suffering, however, is more independent of temperament, and the wisest of women hardly have suffered more. As for Gino, he was quite as boyish as ever, and carried his iniquities like a feather. A favourite speech of his was, "Ah, one ought to marry. Spiridione is wrong. I must persuade him. Not till marriage does one realize the pleasures and the possibilities of life." So saying, he would take down his felt hat, strike it in the right place as infallibly as a German strikes his in the wrong place, and leave her. One evening when he had gone out thus, Lilia could stand it no longer. It was September. Sawston would be just filling up after the summer holidays. People would be running in and out of each other's houses all along the road. There were bicycle gymkhanas, and on the 30th Mrs. Herriton would be holding the annual bazaar in her garden for the C.M.S. It seemed impossible that such a free, happy life could exist. She walked out onto the loggia. Moonlight and stars and a soft purple sky. The walls of Monteriano should be glorious on such a night as this. But the house faced away from them. Perfetta was banging in the kitchen, and the stairs down led past the kitchen door. But the stairs up to the attic, the stairs no one ever used, opened out of the living room, and by unlocking the door at the top one might slip out to the square terrace above the house, and thus for 10 minutes walk in freedom and peace. The key was in the pocket of Gino's best suit, the English check, which he never wore. The stairs creaked and the keyhole screamed, but Perfetta was growing deaf. The walls were beautiful, but as they faced west they were in a shadow. To see the light upon them she must walk round the town a little, till they were caught by the beams of the rising moon. She looked anxiously at the house, and started. It was easy walking, for the little path ran all outside the ramparts. The few people she met wished her a civil good night, taking her, in her hatless condition, for a peasant. The walls trended round towards the moon, and presently she came into its light, and saw all the rough towers turn into pillars of silver and black, and the ramparts into cliffs of pearl. She had no great sense of beauty, but she was sentimental, and she began to cry, for here, where a great cypress interrupted the monotony of the girdle of olives, she had sat with Gino one afternoon in March, her head upon his shoulder, while Caroline was looking at the view and sketching. Round the corner was the Siena gate, from which the road to England started, and she could hear the rumble of the diligence which was going down to catch the night train to Empoli. The next moment it was upon her, for the high road came towards her a little before it began its long zigzag down the hill. The driver slackened and called to her to get in. He did not know who she was. He hoped she might be coming to the station. "Non vengo!" she cried. He wished her good night, and turned his horses down the corner. As the diligence came round she saw that it was empty. "Vengo!" Her voice was tremulous and did not carry. The horses swung off. "Vengo! Vengo!" He had begun to sing and heard nothing. She ran down the road screaming to him to stop, that she was coming, while the distance grew greater and the noise of the diligence increased. The man's back was black and square against the moon, and if he would but turn for an instant she would be saved. She tried to cut off the corner of the zigzag, stumbling over the great clods of earth, large and hard as rocks, which lay between the eternal olives. She was too late, for just before she regained the road the thing swept past her, thunderous, ploughing up choking clouds of moonlit dust. She did not call any more, for she felt very ill, and fainted, and when she revived she was lying in the road, with dust in her eyes, and dust in her mouth, and dust down her ears. There is something very terrible in dust at night time. "What shall I do?" she moaned. "He will be so angry." And without further effort she slowly climbed back to captivity, shaking her garments as she went. Ill luck pursued her to the end. It was one of the nights when Gino happened to come in. He was in the kitchen swearing and smashing plates, while Perfetta, her apron over her head, was weeping violently. At the sight of Lilia he turned upon her and poured forth a flood of miscellaneous abuse. He was far more angry, but much less alarming than he had been that day when he edged after her round the table. And Lilia gained more courage from her bad conscience than she had ever heard from her good one. For as he spoke she was seized with indignation and feared him no longer, and saw him for a cruel, worthless, hypocritical, dissolute upstart, and spoke in return. Perfetta screamed, for she told him everything, all she knew and all she thought. He stood with open mouth, all the anger gone out of him, feeling ashamed and an utter fool. He was fairly and rightfully cornered. When had a husband so given himself away before? She finished, and he was dumb, for she had spoken truly. Then, alas, the absurdity of his own position grew upon him, and he laughed, as he would have laughed at the same situation on the stage. "You laugh?" stammered Lilia. "Ah!" he cried, "who could help it? I, who thought you knew and saw nothing. I'm tricked, I'm conquered, I give in. Let us talk of it no more." He touched her on the shoulder like a good comrade, half amused and half penitent, and then, murmuring and smiling to himself, ran quietly out of the room. Perfetta burst into congratulations. "What courage you have!" she cried, "and what good fortune! He is angry no longer. He has forgiven you." Neither Perfetta, nor Gino, nor Lilia herself knew the true reason of all the misery that followed. To the end he thought that kindness and a little attention would be enough to set things straight. His wife was a very ordinary woman, and why should her ideas differ from his own? No one realized that more than personalities were engaged, that the struggle was national, that generations of ancestors, good, bad, or indifferent, forbade the Latin man to be chivalrous to the Northern woman, the Northern women to forgive the Latin man. All this might have been foreseen. Mrs. Herriton foresaw it from the first. Meanwhile Lilia prided herself on her high personal standard, and Gino simply wondered why she did not come around. He hated discomfort and yearned for sympathy, but shrank from mentioning his difficulties in the town in case they were put down to his own incompetence. Spiridione was told, and replied in a philosophical but not very helpful letter. His other great friend, whom he trusted more, was still serving in Eritrea, or some other desolate outpost. And besides, what was the good of letters? Friends cannot travel through the post. Lilia, so similar to her husband in many ways, yearned for comfort and sympathy too. The night he laughed at her she wildly took up paper and pen and wrote page after page, analyzing his character, enumerating his iniquities, reporting whole conversations, tracing all the causes and the growth of her misery. She was beside herself with passion, and though she could hardly think or see, she suddenly attained to magnificence and pathos which a practised stylist might have envied. It was written like a diary, and not till its conclusion did she realize for whom it was meant. "Irma, darling Irma, this letter is for you. I almost forgot I have a daughter. It will make you unhappy, but I want you to know everything, and you cannot learn things too soon. God bless you, my dearest, and save you. God bless you, miserable mother." Fortunately Mrs. Herriton was in when the letter arrived. She seized it and opened it in her bedroom. Another moment and Irma's placid childhood would have been destroyed for ever. Lilia received a brief note from Harriet, again forbidding direct communication between mother and daughter, and concluding with formal condolences. It nearly drove her mad. "Gently, gently," said her husband. They were sitting together on the loggia when the letter arrived. He often sat with her now, watching her for hours, puzzled and anxious, but not contrite. "It's nothing." She went in and tore it up, and then began to write a very short letter whose gist was, "Come and save me." It is not good to see your wife crying when she writes, especially if you are conscious that, on the whole, your treatment of her has been reasonable and kind. It is not good when you accidentally look over her shoulder and see that she is writing to a man. Nor should she shake her fist at you when she leaves the room, under the impression that you are engaged in lighting a cigar and cannot see her. Lilia went to the post herself, but in Italy so many things could be arranged. The postman was a friend of Gino's, and Mr. Kingcroft never got his letter. So she gave up hope, became ill, and all through the autumn lay in bed. Gino was distracted. She knew why. He wanted a son. He can talk and think of nothing else. His one desire was to become the father of a man like himself, and it held him with a grip he only partially understood. For it was the first great desire, the first great passion of his life. Falling in love was a mere physical triviality, like warm sun or cool water, beside this divine hope of immortality. I continue. He gave candles to Santa Deodata, for he was always religious at a crisis, and sometimes he went to her himself and prayed the crude, uncouth demands of the simple. Impetuously he summoned all his relatives back to bear him company in his time of need, and Lilia saw strange faces flitting past her in the darkened room. "My love," he would say, "my dearest Lilia, be calm. I have never loved any one but you." She, knowing everything, would only smile gently, too broken by suffering to make sarcastic repartees. Before the child was born he gave her a kiss and said, "I have prayed all night for a boy." Some strangely tender impulse moved her, and she said faintly, "You are a boy yourself, Gino." He answered, "Then we shall be brothers." He lay outside the room with his head against the door like a dog. When they came to tell him the glad news, they found him half unconscious, and his face was wet with tears. As for Lilia, someone said to her, "It is a beautiful boy," but she had died in giving birth to him. End of chapter 4, Where Angels Fear to Tread, by E. M. Forster.